The morning at Jefferson County Courthouse began like any other day. Hurried footsteps echoing on polished wooden floors, the weighty thud of leather briefcases packed with files, and the rustling of paper blending into the rhythmic clatter of reporters' keyboards. But something was different that day. A black woman in her mid-40s sat quietly in the front row on the defendant's side. No handcuffs, no dishevelment, no panic. Just a silence neatly folded into an unnervingly upright posture. As if she hadn't come to this courtroom to plead for mercy, but to witness something greater. Her name was Camille Bryant, a name that didn't stand out, a face that made no noise. But in that room, anyone who looked closely would notice one thing: she wasn't like any defendant who had sat in that seat before. A crisp white shirt ironed so precisely that each crease looked like it came straight from military quarters. Dark slacks tailored. Her black hair was braided tightly to the scalp, each curve soft yet firm, like a silent declaration of discipline and self-control. She held no phone. She didn't scan the room. No family sat beside her. Only her lawyer, Elliot Graves, a young, slender black man, barely out of law school, had hands that were trembling slightly as he flipped through a stack of documents. He looked at her, searching for a hint of reassurance, but she didn't return the gaze, not out of coldness, but because Camille was observing the room like a seasoned mind does. Her eyes drifted over everyone: the judge, the prosecutor, the police officers seated in the back row. She missed no glance, no nod, no whisper, not even the faint smirk of the man sitting across from her, Officer Daniel Rourke. A white cop, around 38, in uniform badge, gleaming, wearing the smug grin of a man who'd been forgiven too many times. He wasn't afraid. He seemed amused, because today he was the witness, and Camille is the accused. State versus Camille Bryant, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing beneath the high dome of the courtroom. Camille stood, slowly, with her back straight, eyes steady. A 45-year-old black woman was charged with obstructing a law enforcement officer, assaulting a police officer, and attempting to seize a weapon. No one in the courtroom breathed too loudly, because in a place where the word of a police officer was taken as near absolute truth, Camille Bryant was an anomaly. A middle-aged black woman with no prior record, no blemish on her background, arrested for standing in front of a store. After it had closed, Judge Ronald Whitaker, a white man with silver hair seated high on the bench, narrowed his eyes slightly. Not because he suspected anything, but because something within him didn't feel as routine as it usually did. Something was off, and it wasn't Camille. "Your Honor," Elliot Graves stood, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "The defense is ready. Proceed." The judge nodded. When Daniel Rourke was called to the stand, something in the room shifted. Camille tilted her head slightly. Her fingers gently interlaced, her eyes fixed unblinking on the man walking up with a self-satisfied expression. And when he lowered his head to swear his oath, he began recounting what happened that night. Camille didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move, because she knew liars aren't afraid of their own words. But they tremble before the silence of the one who holds the truth. And there, amid brown wood panels, in a courtroom where the law was measured on scales, Camille Bryant didn't need to demand attention, because the truth, sooner or later, would call her name. The officer stood on the witness stand like an actor on a familiar stage. The badge on his chest gleamed under the lights above, adding to his aura of credibility. Daniel Rourke, a veteran officer of the Jefferson Police Department, had taken his oath, and now he began his performance. "I received a dispatch," he said, his voice clear. pacing his words like a seasoned pro about a suspicious individual lingering near a closed store late at night. When I arrived, I saw the defendant, Miss Camille Bryant, standing there and not moving, doing nothing, but clearly non-compliant. The courtroom was silent. Elliot Graves gripped his pen, his breath shallow. Rourke looked around as if weighing every word, ensuring everyone understood he had no choice. I asked her what she was doing. She refused to answer. I requested her ID. She raised her voice, became disruptive, aggressive. I tried to stay calm. A pause. Rourke lowered his eyes in a well-practiced gesture. But then she struck me in the chest, and I was forced to restrain her for safety. At that point I felt she was reaching for my waist, where my weapon is holstered. Whispers broke out. A woman in the back row muttered, "Sounds familiar." A journalist looked up from his laptop, eyes narrowing as if catching the scent of deceit. Judge Whitaker tapped his gavel lightly. "Order in the courtroom." Rourke nodded in thanks, then turned a cold stare toward Camille. "I had no choice, Your Honor. I acted according to my duty as a peace officer." Camille didn't move. She sat upright, hands still laced, but her gaze had shifted from silence to laser focus. Elliot leaned in, whispered, "Do you want to respond now?" She shook her head. "No need. You don't respond when a liar still believes in his script." Rourke concluded his testimony with a lie so complete that it sounded logical, full of emotion, and nearly impossible to refute. He returned to his seat, glancing smugly at the row of colleagues behind him, flashing a thin, confident smile. A young officer patted his shoulder. Another nodded. No one noticed the faint tremor in Rourke's fingers as he gripped the cup of water on the table. Elliot rose, his voice a little shaky but steady. "Your Honor, before we begin cross-examination, may we request 1 minute to prepare?" "Granted." Judge Whitaker replied, his gaze drifting toward Camille. He suddenly realized no one had asked Camille a single question, and yet she held the room. Camille turned to Elliot, whispered so only he could hear, "Don't rush. We don't need to break the lie. We must shine a light on it, and it'll burn itself." Elliot nodded, his hands trembled less. And when the judge called the court back to order, even if no one admitted it, everyone felt the show had ended. And something real was about to begin. I will speak the truth, not to defend myself, but to remind everyone not all of us bow when insulted. "Miss Bryant," Judge Whitaker said, gently tapping the gavel, "you may now take the stand." Camille stood, slowly, firmly. Though no one said a word, the courtroom seemed to stop breathing. She walked to the witness stand, each step measured upright and steady. Not the walk of someone seeking justice, but of someone who knew she was justice. Camille sat, adjusted the microphone, scanned the courtroom. Still, no one knew who she was. Prosecutor Nathan Cole stepped forward, his voice sharp as a razor's edge. "Miss Bryant, please tell the court what happened that night." Judge Whitaker leaned slightly back in his chair, his eyes on the newly submitted file, though his mind was still trapped in the video just played. The courtroom remained in a strange state, an uneasy silence no longer born of reverence for the law, but of the creeping discomfort in the eyes, the dry swallows of those who once thought they knew who was right and wrong. Daniel Rourke was no longer the man he'd been 45 minutes earlier. He said nothing. He didn't smile. His fingers laced tightly, his thumbs twitching against his thigh, as if restraining himself from making a sound. Elliot stood and nodded to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice deeper than before. We respectfully request that you recall the defendant, Miss Camille Bryant, to clarify an essential element in this case. Whitaker nodded, then turned to Camille. Are you ready? Camille stood without needing to be prompted or assisted by counsel. She walked to the stand like one walks to a command post, not hurried, not hesitant, but this time, something in her stance had changed. When Camille sat, Elliot didn't speak immediately. He stood still as if letting the room see this woman before they heard her. Miss Bryant, he began, you've already told us what happened the night you were arrested. But now I want to ask you something more important. Is there something about yourself that this court doesn't know yet? Camille lifted her head. For the first time since the trial began, her gaze wasn't just sharp. It was ice cold. Yes, she said. Her voice was low, steady, not loud, but so clear each word struck directly into the fissures forming in the jury's psyche. I didn't say this earlier, not because I was hiding it, but because I wanted people to see me as a person, not as a rank, not as a resume, not as someone who needed credentials to prove her worth. She glanced at Elliot. But if now is the time for the full truth, I'll speak. Then she turned and looked straight at the jury, and spoke slowly, each word like a nail hammered into wood. I am Lieutenant Commander Camille Bryant, United States Navy, retired SEAL team. I served over 20 years in the force from Middle Eastern combat zones to the Southern Pacific Seas. I led assault teams, executed rescue missions, and protected the lives of fellow soldiers and civilians I had never even met. I was wounded. I lost people beside me. I stood at the brink of life and death, and none of that ever made me afraid. The courtroom was silent, not out of shock, but shame for the way they had looked at a black woman standing trial without ever asking, who is she? Camille didn't stop. She continued without tears, without tremors. I'm not the first person to be suspected because of my skin color, and I'm not the first to be shoved into a squad car for asking what did I do wrong. But maybe I am the first who has returned from the battlefield only to be treated like a criminal on the very soil I risked my life to defend. Rourke lowered his head, unable to look up. A woman in the back row raised a hand to her mouth, eyes glistening. A juror removed his glasses and wiped his eyes unapologetically. Camille concluded, I don't need forgiveness because I did nothing wrong. And I don't need applause for being a veteran. I want to ask, why is everything I've done for this country still not enough for an officer like Daniel Rourke to see me as a human being? No one answered. No one dared to. Because some questions need no answers, they must be heard to expose the raw core of injustice. The air in the courtroom was thick as fog, not from lack of light, but because everything they once believed about order, authority, and credibility was unraveling. Camille Bryant had risen not as a defendant, but as living proof of a system's blindness. But the trial wasn't over, and Elliot Graves knew this was the moment to strike at the root of the lie. Your Honor, Elliot said, voice sharp as steel, but astonishingly controlled. The defense requests permission to directly confront the witness officer Daniel Rourke. A slight flinch from Rourke was barely perceptible, but Camille saw it. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She tilted her head like someone too familiar with cowards hiding behind uniforms. Officer Rourke, Elliot began once the man was back on the stand. You previously stated that my client Miss Bryant initiated an assault on you. Is that correct? Yes, Rourke replied, voice gruff and cold, and she attempted to reach for your weapon. She made a clear motion toward my belt. Elliot didn't react. He nodded slightly as if guiding his opponent into a trap of his own making. Do you have any physical evidence? Fingerprints, bruises, medical video analysis? Rourke hesitated. No, but I know what I saw. Elliot nodded. You know what you saw, he repeated, then turned to the jury. But this entire courtroom has also seen a video. He spun back, and in that video she does not resist. She does not advance toward you. She does nothing threatening. Rourke began to sweat, hands tightening on the stand, jaw twitching. Elliot stepped closer, his voice dropping nearly a whisper, but still clear enough for all to hear. How do you explain the contradiction between your testimony and the video captured by an uninvolved, impartial, random bystander? Rourke licked his lips. The video doesn't show everything. It starts in the middle. Elliot didn't back down, didn't rush. He stood firm, gaze razor sharp. You're right. It doesn't show everything. But the missing beginning doesn't invalidate the ending. The latter part of the footage shows a calm, respectful, non-resisting woman shoved into a squad car. And your voice, women like you don't get to ask questions, requires no context to reveal what you think of human rights. A tremor rippled through the gallery. No one said a word, but the room leaned toward truth. Elliot took another step. Did you know who she was? Rourke glared. Not at the time. And now you know who she is. A former SEAL. No, not just a former officer. A lieutenant commander who risked her life in missions you couldn't even imagine. So I'll ask again. Are you ashamed knowing the woman you insulted, shoved, falsely accused, is someone who fought for your right to wear that uniform and badge today? Daniel Rourke did not answer. He lowered his head, his fists clenched, his whole body looked like it was bracing against a truth crashing down. Elliot turned to the jury, his voice no longer cold but full of a bitter ache. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the most terrifying thing isn't an abusive officer. The system allowed him to believe that no one would ever question him, until today. Camille sat still, but for the first time a spark flickered in her eyes. Not of joy, but of realization the wall was starting to crack. When Elliot returned to his seat, the courtroom remained silent. But it wasn't a silence of tension, it was awareness, a strange quiet as if everyone had just looked in a mirror and weren't sure they liked what they saw. Daniel Rourke no longer looked up. He sat slumped, silent, hands limp. The officers behind him sat frozen as if their seats had turned to stone. And in the center of it all, Camille Bryant still sat upright, her gaze not angry, not cold, calm. Judge Whitaker adjusted his mic, preparing to close the session for the day, but he paused for a moment of hesitation. Miss Bryant, he said slower than usual, if you have anything you'd like to say directly to the jury, now is the time. Camille stood. No aid, no notes, no preparation. She stepped forward, not like someone proving a point, but like someone emerging from a storm, still standing. I know I'm not the first to be misunderstood. Camille began, her voice low, not loud, but full of weight. And I also know I won't be the last. I'm not here to brag. Not because I was a lieutenant commander, not because I led elite teams, but if I, with all my training, discipline, and record of service, can be shoved into a squad car for standing in the wrong place with the wrong skin, then others without voice, without rank, what chance do they have? Camille's gaze swept across the jury. None looked away. Dignity has no uniform, no rank, no certificate. It lives in our eyes, in how we stand after being knocked down, And in the silence, when no one will hear our words. I've been silent for years. I believed that if I were competent, humble, and disciplined, justice would protect me. I was wrong. Her voice didn't crack, didn't shake. It was like ice, precise but piercing. I've faced pirates. I've walked through minefields. I've taken midnight orders with no return path. But never, never did I think the hardest battle would be on a sidewalk. In my own country. A sharp inhale came from somewhere. A woman in the audience reached for a tissue. Camille turned toward Daniel Rourke, now too ashamed to lift his head, then back to the jury. I don't want your pity. I don't ask for your respect. I hope, if you still believe in justice, don't consider me an exception. See me as a warning. If this system can do that to me, it can do it to anyone. Camille paused. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't seek sympathy. She returned to her seat like someone completing her final duty before leaving the field. And when she sat down for the first time since the trial began, the jury nodded in unison. Not in agreement, but in awakening. The afternoon passed in silence, as if the entire city held its breath. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. Some held signs, others stood still, eyes fixed on the doors as the bell tower struck 4, marking the end of deliberations. Camille Bryant sat still inside the courtroom, her hands resting gently on her lap. Her face showed no worry or hope, only the calm familiarity of someone who had long grown used to standing at the edge of life and death. Elliot Graves stood beside her, both hands on the table, his eyes fixed on the rear door of the courtroom, where the jury was about to walk in with a single piece of paper, possibly carrying a turning point. The doors swung open. Leading the jury was a white woman in her 50s. Her eyes neither flinched nor wavered. She walked to the front, accepted the paper from the court officer, then turned to face a courtroom so silent it felt vacuumed of air. Judge Whitaker spoke deep and steady. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have your honor. Please read it. The woman unfolded the sheet. Her voice wasn't loud, but solid like a gavel pounding against a door of belief that had been closed for far too long. In the case of the state of Georgia versus Camille Bryant, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all counts. A beat of silence. Then emotion rippled through the room, a few breathless gasps, a muffled sob from the back, and one person clapped quietly, but it rang out like the cracking of long frozen ice. Camille closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She simply exhaled as if for the first time in days she was finally breathing freely after suffocating under invisible weight and indignity. The juror hadn't folded the paper yet. She continued reading, this time not a verdict, but a recommendation. We, the jury, also recommend that an official investigation be opened into the conduct of Officer Daniel Rourke, including but not limited to abuse of power, perjury, and violation of arrest protocols. Another wave swept across the courtroom. Daniel Rourke's face was pale, his hand clenching the edge of his seat, no longer resembling a police officer. He was just a man whose final facade had fallen, and who had to face consequences for the first time. Judge Whitaker nodded slowly and tapped his gavel. The court accepts the recommendation. Officer Rourke, I advise you to seek legal counsel, because this is only the beginning. Camille turned to Elliot. He placed a hand on her shoulder without a word. There was no need. They both knew this wasn't just their victory, it was the victory of truth, long buried, now risen. The courtroom doors swung open. The afternoon sun cast streaks of golden-orange light across the marble steps like silent medals laid beneath the feet of those walking out of a trial that would forever change a town. Camille Bryant stood at the highest step. In front of her, cameras, microphones and reporters jostled for position. Behind her, Elliot Graves, the young attorney who once trembled with every page, was now silent, his gaze unwavering. Beside her, strangers, but all wearing the same look: admiration, awareness, awakening. A reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Lieutenant Commander Bryant, do you have anything to say to the public after everything?" Camille didn't step down. She stood tall above all eyes, but never arrogant. Sunlight lit her shoulders. Her face wore no makeup, no tension, just truth, and a belief that could not be broken. "I'm not speaking for myself," she began. "I'm speaking for those who were shoved into police cars while walking home, for those who were told to stop because of the color of their skin, for those who stayed silent because they knew no one would believe them." She paused. The entire square held its breath. "I didn't win today because I'm special. I won because I refused to let silence define my dignity. And I hope those who hear me won't either." Elliot stood behind her, eyes glassy but nodding gently. A brown-skinned woman in the crowd covered her mouth, sobbing. An older man in a faded military uniform raised his hand in salute, then bowed. Camille looked around, her eyes missing no one. Justice is not a courtroom. It is action. It is the gaze that dares to hold, the question that dares to be asked, the step that dares to move even when the path ahead is injustice. I don't promise I can fix the entire system, but I will not leave the ranks of those who refuse to bow. And if you've stayed silent before, today is the day to speak." She turned away. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't seek a camera lens. Camille Bryant descended each step not like a woman who had just won a verdict, but like a soldier who had completed a mission and was ready for the next fight. The crowd parted, but no one called her veteran, victim, or hero. They watched like one watches a truth that can no longer be denied. Weeks later, Daniel Rourke was suspended from duty, then charged with perjury, abuse of authority, and civil rights violations. The Jefferson Police Department restructured its recruitment policies and retrained its officers in conduct and de-escalation. Some officers resigned. Others began to listen. Camille refused television interviews. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't go on tour. She returned to her small home by the forest. Occasionally, she spoke at schools, veterans' halls, and places where voices are meant to be sharpened, not buried. People didn't remember her for her rank. They remembered her because she didn't stay silent when the world expected her to.